The wind howled through the frozen landscape, rattling the windows of the old Jeep as it barreled down an empty stretch of highway. Chris gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white against the faint glow of the dashboard lights. Beside him, Emma tugged her coat tighter, trying to shake the chill that had deepened her bones. The heater was barely working, and the frost forming on the inside of the windows made it feel like they were driving through a freezer. This was a bad idea, Emma muttered, breaking the uneasy silence that had filled the car for the past hour. It's not like we had a choice, Chris replied, his eyes scanning the snow-covered road ahead. The storm came out of nowhere, and there's no way we were going to find a motel in that little town back there. We'll make it to the next one soon. Emma sighed, but said nothing more. The storm had indeed caught them off guard. What was supposed to be a fun winter road trip had turned into a fight against nature. The radio had warned of worsening conditions, but they dismissed it, thinking they could push through. Now the snow was falling so heavily that the taillights of the car were barely visible, casting an eerie red glow against the swirling white. As the minutes ticked by, the road, though, seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees on either side appearing as dark, skeletal sentinels in the distance. Chris's grip on the wheel tightened as a sharp bend loomed ahead, nearly obscured by the thick snow. As they rounded the curve, the headlights illuminated a small figure standing in the middle of the road. "Chris, stop!" Emma screamed, her hand flying to the dashboard. Chris slammed on the brakes, and the Jeep skidded, the tires struggling to find purchase on the icy surface. The vehicle came to a shuddering halt just feet away from the figure, a young girl no older than 10, dressed in a thin, tattered dress. Her hair hung in wet, frozen strands, and her pale skin seemed almost translucent in the glare of the headlights. "What the hell?" Chris muttered, unbuckling his seatbelt. "Don't get out," Emma said quickly, grabbing his arm. "Something about this isn't right." Chris hesitated, but then shook his head. "She's a kid, Emma. She'll freeze out here." He opened the door, and a blast of icy wind filled the car. Emma shivered, watching as Chris stepped out into the snow. He approached the girl slowly, his breath visible in the frigid air. "Hey, are you okay?" he called out, his voice trembling slightly. The girl didn't move. She stood perfectly still, her head tilted slightly downward, her arms limp at her sides. As Chris reached her, he crouched down, trying to meet her gaze. "Where are your parents? Are you lost?" he asked, his voice softening. The girl's head slowly lifted, and Chris recoiled. Her eyes were entirely black. No whites, no pupils, just two dark voids that seemed to swallow the light. Her lips parted, and a faint, whispery voice emerged. "You shouldn't be here." Chris stumbled backward, his boots slipping on the ice. He turned to run back to the car, but the girl's voice rang out again, louder this time, almost a shriek. "You shouldn't be here!" The Jeep's engine sputtered and died, plunging Emma into silence and darkness. She fumbled with her phone, desperate for some light, but it wouldn't turn on. The cold seemed to seep into her chest, making it hard to breathe. When she looked up, Chris was gone. "Chris!" she screamed, her voice breaking. She scrambled out of the car, the snow immediately soaking through her boots. The girl was gone, and the road was empty, save for the faint footprints leading into the forest. Against every instinct, Emma followed the tracks. The trees closed in around her, their branches heavy with snow, creating a suffocating canopy. The only sound was the crunch of her footsteps and the pounding of her heart. "Chris!" she called again, her voice echoing eerily. The footprints ended abruptly in a small clearing. In the center stood an old wooden sign, its paint faded and peeling. Emma squinted, brushing snow from its surface. The words sent a chill down her spine. Camp Hollow Pines. Closed since 1987. A twig snapped behind her, and she spun around. Chris stood at the edge of the clearing, his back to her. Relief flooded her chest, and she ran toward him. "Chris, thank God! What happened? We need to." He turned slowly, and Emma's words caught in her throat. His eyes were just like the girl's, black voids that seemed to draw her in. His mouth stretched into a twisted smile, and his voice came out in a hollow, unfamiliar tone. "You shouldn't be here." Emma stumbled backward, tripping over a root. Her head hit the ground, and darkness enveloped her. When she awoke, she was back in the Jeep, the engine humming softly. Chris was in the driver's seat, his hands on the wheel, his face expressionless. The snow had stopped, and the road ahead was clear. "Chris?" she whispered, her voice shaking. He didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the road, unblinking. Emma turned to look behind them, and her blood ran cold. The girl was sitting in the back seat, her black eyes staring into Emma's soul. "You shouldn't be here," the girl said one last time. The Jeep lurched forward, and the road seemed to vanish beneath them, replaced by endless darkness. The snow fell heavily, blanketing the narrow mountain road in a suffocating white haze. The old Chevy rattled against the wind as Kyle and Jenna navigated the treacherous path. The dashboard clock glowed dimly, 11:47 p.m., mocking them with the late hour. They were miles away from any town, their phone signals long dead. "We should have stopped when we had the chance," Jenna said, her voice tight. She rubbed her gloved hands together for warmth, glancing nervously at the dark forest looming outside. Kyle kept his eyes on the road, gripping the wheel. "We couldn't have known the storm would hit this hard. There's a rest stop a few miles ahead. We'll pull over there." But Jenna wasn't reassured. She stared at the flurries of snow whipping past the headlights, her unease growing. The storm felt unnatural, like the mountain itself was alive and angry. As they rounded a bend, a shadow flickered at the edge of the headlight's beam, a figure standing just off the road. Jenna gasped. "Did you see that?" she asked, clutching Kyle's arm. "See what?" "There was someone there," she insisted. "Standing by the trees." Kyle shook his head. "It's probably just your imagination. This storm is playing tricks on us." But Jenna couldn't shake the image. A man, gaunt and motionless, wearing tattered clothes, his face obscured by shadows. Minutes passed in tense silence until the Chevy's headlights illuminated a wooden sign. It was old and rotting, barely legible beneath the snow. Jenna leaned forward to read it aloud. "Eagles Hollow Rest Stop. 1 mile." She sighed with relief. Finally. The road narrowed further, the forest encroaching on both sides, the trees twisted and bare. When they finally pulled into the rest stop, the relief was short-lived. The lot was empty except for a single rusted pickup truck parked near the entrance. The building itself was a small, derelict cabin, its windows fogged with frost and grime. "Great," Jenna muttered. "This place looks like the setting for a horror movie." Kyle laughed nervously. "Let's just stretch our legs and use the bathroom. We'll get back on the road soon." As they stepped out of the car, the cold bit into their skin. Jenna pulled her scarf tighter around her neck, her breath fogging in the icy air. The wind carried an eerie silence with it, as though the world had stopped breathing. The cabin's door creaked loudly as Kyle pushed it open. The air inside was stale and heavy, carrying the faint scent of decay. A single overhead bulb flickered weakly, casting distorted shadows. The restrooms were to the left, and a small, unattended counter sat to the right. Jenna hesitated. "This feels wrong. Let's just leave." "We'll be quick," Kyle said, heading toward the restrooms. As he disappeared behind the door, Jenna stayed near the counter, her anxiety growing. She noticed a dusty guest log lying open, the pages yellowed and curling. Out of curiosity, she flipped to the most recent entry. It was dated 20 years ago. The door to the men's room creaked open. Kyle stepped out, his face pale. "Let's go." "Now." "What's wrong?" Jenna asked. "Just get in the car." They hurried back outside, but as they approached the Chevy, Jenna stopped dead. There, in the snow just a few feet from the car, were fresh footprints. They circled the vehicle, their pattern erratic and strange, like someone had been stumbling or limping. "Kyle," she whispered, "those weren't there before." He didn't respond. Instead, he grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the car. They climbed in, locking the doors. Kyle turned the key in the ignition, but the engine sputtered and died. "Come on," he shouted, trying again. The engine groaned, but refused to start. Jenna glanced out the window, her heart pounding. A figure stood at the edge of the rest stop, barely visible in the snow. It was the same man she had seen earlier, his face now illuminated by the Chevy's dim headlights. His eyes were sunken, his skin gray and mottled. He smiled, revealing blackened teeth, and raised one skeletal hand to point directly at her. "Drive," Jenna screamed. Kyle slammed the key again, and this time the engine roared to life. The Chevy lurched forward, the tires skidding on the icy pavement. As they sped away, Jenna looked back. The figure hadn't moved, but more shapes emerged from the tree line. Dozens of them, all watching, their hollow eyes following the car. "Don't look back," Kyle said through gritted teeth. But Jenna couldn't help it. As they rounded a bend, the rest stop disappeared from view, and with it, the figures. For a brief moment, relief washed over her. Then she saw the road ahead. The figures were there, standing in the middle of the highway. They stretched for miles, their gaunt forms motionless as the snow swirled around them. One by one, their heads turned to face the oncoming car. Kyle slammed on the brakes, but the Chevy skidded uncontrollably. The last thing Jenna saw before the world went dark was the man's face pressed against her window, his hollow smile etched into her mind forever. The snowstorm came faster than expected, blanketing the winding highway in an icy fury. Eric and Melissa's sedan struggled against the relentless winds, its wipers barely keeping up with the blinding flakes. What had started as a scenic winter road trip was quickly becoming a nightmare. "We should stop," Melissa said, her voice trembling. "This is getting too dangerous." "There's nothing out here," Eric replied, his hands gripping the wheel. He leaned forward, squinting to see past the thick snow. "We haven't seen another car for miles. Just keep an eye out for a sign or something." As if in answer, the headlights caught a wooden sign leaning precariously by the side of the road. It read, "Blair Pines Lodge, 5 miles ahead." "There!" Melissa exclaimed. "A lodge. We can wait out the storm." Eric nodded and turned onto the narrow, unplowed road indicated by the sign. The tires crunched through fresh snow, the darkness around them growing denser as the trees thickened. The lodge appeared abruptly, its silhouette looming out of the storm like a forgotten relic. It was massive but aged, with its paint peeling and windows dark. A faint light glowed from within. "This place is something," Eric muttered as he parked. The wind howled as they stepped out, their boots sinking into the deep snow. The lodge door creaked open before they even reached it, revealing a tall man with gaunt features and sunken eyes. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was welcoming enough. "Come in. The storm's bad tonight." Inside, the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and something faintly metallic. The lobby was dimly lit by an old chandelier, its bulbs flickering occasionally. A fire crackled weakly in the stone hearth, offering little warmth. "I'm Mr. Hawthorne," the man said, gesturing toward a worn check-in desk. "You're lucky you found this place. The storm's worse than the forecast predicted." Melissa hesitated, her unease growing. "Do you get many visitors?" Hawthorne smiled thinly. "Not in years, but we're always ready for guests." The words felt wrong, but the storm outside left no room for argument. They were shown to a room on the second floor, sparsely furnished but clean enough. The bed was large, its wooden frame carved with intricate, unfamiliar designs. "This feels weird," Melissa whispered as she unpacked. "It's like this place is stuck in time." "It's just old," Eric reassured her. "Let's get some sleep. We'll leave first thing in the morning." The wind howled louder as the night deepened, and Melissa found herself unable to sleep. The old radiator hissed, and shadows danced across the walls in erratic patterns. She rolled over to nudge Eric, but froze. The bed was empty. "Eric?" she whispered, sitting up. The bathroom door was ajar, and the faint sound of running water echoed within. She padded over, her breath visible in the frigid air. The bathroom was empty. The sound of running water wasn't coming from the faucet. It was coming from the hallway. Heart pounding, Melissa opened the door and stepped into the corridor. The lights flickered weakly, casting long shadows that seemed to twist and move. The sound of water grew louder, leading her to a staircase at the end of the hall. She descended, her steps hesitant, the old wood groaning beneath her weight. The source of the sound became clear, a dark stain spreading across the floor near the hearth. Water dripped steadily from somewhere above, pooling in the center of the room. But as she got closer, Melissa realized it wasn't water. It was blood. A sharp creak made her spin around. Mr. Hawthorne stood in the doorway, his face partially obscured by the dim light. "Is everything all right, miss?" he asked, his voice carrying an unnatural calm. "Where's Eric?" Melissa demanded, her voice shaking. "Your friend?" Hawthorne tilted his head slightly. "He wandered off. The storm can make people restless." Melissa backed away, her heart hammering in her chest. "You're lying. Where is he?" Hawthorne's smile widened, revealing teeth too sharp, too jagged. "Some guests are harder to keep than others." Melissa bolted for the stairs, her feet slipping on the blood-slick floor. She scrambled back to her room, slamming the door shut behind her. Grabbing her phone, she tried to call for help, but there was no signal. The storm raged outside, trapping her. A soft knock came at the door. "Melissa," came Eric's voice, muffled and wrong. "Let me in." Tears streamed down her face. "Eric?" she whispered. The knock came again, louder this time. "Melissa, it's me. Open the door." Her hand hesitated on the doorknob. Something was off. Eric's voice was hollow, emotionless. Then she noticed the shadows under the door. Too many shadows, as if more than one person stood on the other side. "Melissa," the voice repeated, now a chorus of distorted tones. "Let us in." She backed away just as the door handle twisted violently. The wood splintered and the door burst open, but it wasn't Eric standing there. A mass of figures crowded the doorway, their faces featureless, their forms flickering like static. They moved as one, stepping into the room, their hollow voices echoing. "You shouldn't have come." Melissa screamed as the darkness consumed her, the storm outside swallowing the lodge in an endless, suffocating silence. The next morning, the highway patrol found the road to Blair Pine's lodge completely buried in snow. No lodge had stood there for over 50 years, and no trace of Eric or Melissa was ever found. The winter night was eerily still as Emma, Jake, and Lauren sped down the desolate highway. Their road trip had started as a fun adventure, but as the snowstorm grew fiercer, their laughter faded into uneasy silence. The map app had rerouted them onto an unfamiliar back road, promising a shortcut. Now, it felt like they were driving into the middle of nowhere. The car's headlights barely cut through the swirling snow, and the trees lining the road loomed like silent sentinels. Emma, in the passenger seat, squinted at her phone, though the screen had been frozen on searching for signal for the past 20 minutes. "This doesn't feel right," she said. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Jake, who was driving, tightened his grip on the wheel. "It's what the GPS said. It's either this or sit on the highway until morning." Lauren, in the back seat, peered out the window. "It's creepy out here, like we're the only people left in the world." Emma shivered, but not from the cold. Something about the emptiness of the road, the oppressive darkness set her nerves on edge. They hadn't passed another car in over an hour. Just as she was about to suggest turning back, the headlights caught a shape ahead. A sign, old and warped, stood at the edge of the road. Its faded letters read, "Welcome to Cold Hollow." "Cold Hollow?" Lauren repeated, leaning forward. "That sounds like the title of a horror movie." "It's probably just some tiny town," Jake said. "Maybe they've got a diner or something. We can stop for the night." They drove on, the road narrowing and the snow piling higher with each mile. Soon, a faint glow appeared in the distance. As they drew closer, they saw it was a gas station, its flickering neon sign casting an eerie light on the snow. Jake pulled into the lot, parking beside a single rusty pump. The station looked ancient, its windows caked with grime. A hand-painted open sign hung crookedly on the door. "I'll fill up the tank," Jake said. "You two stay here." Emma watched him step out into the cold, his breath visible in the freezing air. She didn't like the look of the place. Something about it felt off. Jake disappeared inside after fumbling with the pump. Minutes ticked by. The station's neon sign buzzed faintly, and the wind howled around the car. "What's taking him so long?" Lauren asked, her voice tinged with anxiety. Emma didn't answer. She was staring at something in the rearview mirror. A figure standing at the edge of the lot. It was barely visible through the swirling snow, but its outline was unmistakable. Tall and still, it watched them with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Lauren," Emma whispered, her voice shaking. "Look." Lauren turned, her face going pale as she spotted the figure. "What is that? Is it a person?" Emma grabbed her phone, but the camera wouldn't focus on the shadowy shape. She opened the door, stepping out into the cold. "Jake?" she called toward the station. The door creaked open, and Jake emerged, his face pale. "We need to go. Now." "What happened?" Emma asked as he hurried past her to the car. "No time. Just get in," he snapped, starting the engine. As they pulled out of the lot, Emma looked back. The figure was gone. "Jake, what did you see in there?" she pressed. He hesitated, gripping the wheel tightly. "The guy at the counter, he was weird. Kept asking if we'd seen them. Said something about people disappearing out here." "People?" Lauren echoed, her voice rising. "He said anyone who stops in Cold Hollow doesn't leave," Jake muttered. "Thought he was just crazy, but then he handed me this." Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out a scrap of paper. Written in shaky handwriting were the words, "Don't stop again. They know you're here." The temperature in the car seemed to plummet. The snow outside thickened, obscuring the road. It was as if the storm were alive, trying to trap them. Suddenly, the car jolted. Jake cursed as he fought to keep it on the road. "Flat tire," he groaned, pulling to a stop. "We can't stop," Emma shouted, panic rising. What do you want me to do? Drive on the rim. Jake shot back, already stepping out to inspect the damage. The moment he closed the door, the silence in the car became deafening. Lauren clutched Emma's arm, her eyes wide. Look, she whispered, pointing out the windshield. The snow had stopped falling. The road ahead was clear, but lined on either side were figures. Dozens of them. They stood motionless, their faces obscured by the shadows of their hoods. Emma's heart raced as she realized they were all staring at the car. Jake! She screamed, throwing open her door. He was crouched by the tire, oblivious. He turned at her voice, his expression confused, but then his eyes widened. Emma spun around. The figures were closer now, their silent forms advancing on the car. Get in! Get in! Jake shouted, abandoning the tire. They barely slammed the doors shut before the figures reached the car. One pressed its pale, clawed hand against Emma's window, its face finally visible. Its eyes were hollow pits, its mouth twisted into an unnatural grin. Jake floored the gas, the car lurching forward on its damaged tire. The figures didn't chase them, but stood in the road, watching as the car sped away. Hours later, they reached the main highway, the glow of distant city lights breaking through the darkness. No one spoke. No one dared look back. They never found Cold Hollow on any map. But that night, when they stopped at a diner miles from the mountains, Emma noticed something. The same pale, clawed handprint was smeared across the rear window, as though it had never left. The icy winds howled as Logan, Mia, and Derek drove along the isolated stretch of Highway 46. The group was returning from a winter cabin trip that had gone longer than expected, and now they were racing against a snowstorm, threatening to bury the road ahead. Do you think we'll make it to the next town before the storm gets worse? Mia asked from the back seat, her breath fogging up the window. Logan glanced at the clock on the dashboard. If we keep up this pace, yeah, just keep an eye out for the turnoff. Derek, riding shotgun, leaned forward, his face lit eerily by the glow of his phone. Signal's still dead. No GPS, no updates on the storm. Feels like we're driving into the Twilight Zone. Mia laughed nervously, but Logan didn't reply. He was too focused on the road, which seemed to narrow the further they went. The snow was relentless, reducing visibility to just a few feet ahead. The only light came from their high beams reflecting off the endless flurry. After what felt like hours, a sign appeared, its faded letters barely legible. Hollow Creek Rest Stop, 2 miles ahead. Perfect timing, Derek said. We can take a break, let the storm die down. Mia hesitated. I don't know. Something about stopping out here feels wrong. You'd rather risk skidding off the road? Logan asked. He signaled right, the tires crunching through the deepening snow as they turned onto the rest stop's exit. The rest stop appeared out of nowhere, a small, dimly lit gas station and diner huddled together against the storm. The parking lot was empty, save for an ancient pickup truck covered in snow. A single flickering streetlight cast long, distorted shadows across the lot. This place looks like it hasn't seen a customer in years, Derek said as they parked. It's shelter, Logan said. Let's stretch our legs and grab something warm. Inside the diner, the air was stale, heavy with the smell of burnt coffee and grease. The booths were torn, the tables scratched and sticky. A lone man sat at the counter, his back to them, hunched over a cup of coffee. A waitress appeared, startling them. Her uniform was old-fashioned, her hair pinned up in a way that felt decades out of place. She smiled too wide. Welcome in. Cold night, isn't it? Yeah, Logan said, trying to shake off the uneasy vibe. Just passing through. Coffee and a menu, please. She nodded and disappeared into the kitchen. The group slid into a booth near the window. Outside, the snow was coming down harder, the wind rattling the glass. This place gives me the creeps, Mia whispered. Doesn't it feel off? It's a rest stop, not the Ritz, Logan replied, though he couldn't shake the strange feeling either. Derek stared at the lone man at the counter. Think he's a regular? He hasn't moved since we got here. Before anyone could answer, the waitress returned with 3 steaming mugs of coffee. She placed them down with practiced precision, her smile never faltering. Storm this bad. You 3 might want to stay the night, she said. We've got rooms in the back. Logan shook his head. Thanks, but we're trying to get to the next town. Her smile faltered for just a second. So brief, Logan wasn't sure he saw it. Suit yourself. Just be careful out there. The group drank their coffee in silence, the unease growing thicker with each passing moment. Derek was the first to notice it. The man at the counter had turned around. But his face wasn't right. His features were blurred, like an old photograph left out in the rain. His eyes were sunken black pits, his mouth twisted into an unnatural grimace. He was staring directly at them. "Don't look," Derek stammered, his voice trembling. But it was too late. Mia gasped, dropping her mug, and Logan's hand froze halfway to his own. The man rose from his stool, his movements jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on invisible strings. "Time to go," Logan whispered. The three bolted for the door, ignoring the waitress's shouts behind them. They piled into the car, the engine roaring to life as Logan slammed on the gas. The diner faded into the blizzard behind them, but the oppressive feeling lingered. Logan drove in silence, his eyes darting nervously between the road and the mirrors. "We shouldn't have stopped there," Mia said, her voice shaking. "We're fine," Logan replied, though his knuckles were white on the wheel. "We're out of there." But then Derek pointed ahead. "Logan, what the hell is that?" Through the snow, the diner's neon sign glowed faintly in the distance. "No," Logan muttered. "That's impossible. We've been driving for miles." The car passed by the same pickup truck, parked in the same empty lot. The same flickering streetlight buzzed above them. They were back. "Turn around!" Mia screamed. Logan spun the wheel, tires skidding as they turned back onto the highway. But the road didn't lead them away. The headlights illuminated the diner again, closer this time, its windows dark and empty. Logan slammed on the brakes. This can't be happening. The air inside the car grew heavy, suffocating. A shadow passed by the window, and a tap came at Logan's door. "Don't look," Mia begged, clutching her knees. But Logan couldn't help himself. He turned his head, and there it was, the man from the diner, his twisted face pressed against the glass. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, coming from all sides of the car. Shadows surrounded them, figures moving unnaturally in the snow. The windshield fogged over, leaving them blind. Then, silence. When search crews found the car 3 days later, it was buried in snow, the engine dead. Inside, the seats were empty, the coffee mugs still steaming in the cup holders. No one ever saw Logan, Mia, or Derek again. The Hollow Creek rest stop remains, its neon sign glowing faintly through the endless snow. Travelers who see it from the highway say it calls to them, its light flickering like a heartbeat in the storm. The snowstorm hit harder than expected, and Tom, Lisa, and Eric found themselves driving through an endless expanse of white. The highway was barely visible beneath the thick layer of snow, and the towering pines on either side seemed to close in with every mile. Their original plan was to take the scenic route back home after their ski trip, but now the scenic route felt like a mistake. The car's heater worked overtime, and yet Lisa couldn't shake the chill in her bones. She sat in the back seat, her phone useless without a signal. "We should have stayed at the lodge another night," she muttered. Tom, at the wheel, glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "If we didn't leave when we did, we'd be snowed in for days. We just need to push through. There's a motel marked on the map up ahead." "Yeah, because nothing bad ever happens at an isolated motel," Eric joked from the passenger seat, though his laugh was weak. The group fell silent as the car rounded a bend, revealing an old sign barely standing in the snow. Its letters were faded, but they could still make out. "Snow Ridge Inn, 5 miles ahead." Lisa groaned. "That sounds charming." "Better than sleeping in the car," Tom replied, gripping the wheel tighter as the road became narrower. The Snow Ridge Inn loomed in the distance, a hulking structure surrounded by darkness. Its lights flickered weakly against the storm, casting eerie shadows over the snow-covered parking lot. A single car, an old station wagon, was parked near the entrance. Tom pulled up to the building and the group stepped out into the biting cold. The wind howled, nearly drowning out the creak of the wooden porch as they climbed the steps. The front door opened with a groan, revealing a dimly lit lobby that smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic. Behind the counter stood a man, his face gaunt and pale. His eyes seemed too large for his face, and his smile stretched unnaturally wide. "Welcome to the Snow Ridge Inn," he said, his voice raspy. "Looking for rooms?" "Just for the night," Tom said, his voice cautious. The man nodded and slid a logbook across the counter. "Sign in, and I'll get you your keys." Lisa hesitated. "You still use a logbook?" "Old-fashioned charm," the man replied, his smile never faltering. Eric leaned in to write their names, but his pen froze over the page. The last entry, dated 2 weeks prior, was smeared with red stains. He quickly scribbled their names, avoiding Lisa's questioning glance. The man handed over a single key. Room 13, top of the stairs to the right. Lucky us, Lisa mumbled under her breath. The room was small and sparse, with 2 creaky twin beds and a worn-out armchair. The wallpaper peeled at the edges, and the single window was frosted over, letting in only a faint glow from the storm outside. "This place is awful," Lisa said, dropping her bag onto the floor. "I'd rather sleep in the car." Eric flopped onto one of the beds, which groaned under his weight. "It's just for one night. We'll leave at first light." Tom sat by the window, peering out. "Does it seem weird to you that there's only one other car out there?" Lisa shrugged. "Maybe we're the only ones dumb enough to drive in a blizzard." As night fell, the storm intensified, and with it came strange noises. A faint tapping at the window, a creak in the hallway, the distant sound of laughter, though the inn seemed deserted. Lisa sat up in bed, her heart racing. "Did you hear that?" Eric, half asleep, groaned. "Hear what?" "It sounded like someone laughing." Tom turned from the window, his face pale. "I thought I saw someone outside earlier, standing by the other car." Lisa shivered. "Stop, you're just trying to freak me out." But the tension in the room was palpable. Tom locked the door and wedged a chair under the handle for good measure. The tapping returned, louder this time. All 3 of them stared at the window. Slowly, Lisa reached for the curtain and yanked it aside. There was nothing there, only the snow swirling in the darkness. But then, faintly, the glass fogged up. Something was breathing on the other side. Lisa stumbled back, her voice trembling. "Someone's out there." Tom grabbed a flashlight and shined it through the window. The beam caught a glimpse of something. Someone, just beyond the edge of the light. A face, pale and grinning, vanished into the storm. Without a word, the 3 of them bolted for the door. They raced down the stairs and into the lobby, but the desk was empty, the logbook gone. The front door was ajar, snow blowing inside. "Where's the guy who checked us in?" Eric asked, his voice panicked. Tom didn't answer. He yanked the door open, and they ran for the car. The station wagon in the lot was frosted over, its windows too opaque to see inside. But as they passed it, Lisa glanced back and froze. A figure was sitting in the driver's seat, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. Its eyes followed her as she ran. Tom started the car, the engine sputtering to life. They sped away from the inn, the headlights cutting through the storm. None of them spoke, their breaths fogging the air as they tried to process what they'd seen. After an hour of driving, they spotted a gas station. It was brightly lit, a beacon of normalcy in the endless snow. They pulled in, desperate for warmth and answers. The clerk behind the counter looked up as they entered, his face puzzled. "You guys okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Tom nodded, catching his breath. "We stayed at the Snow Ridge Inn. Something's wrong with that place." The clerk's expression darkened. "The Snow Ridge Inn? That place burned down 5 years ago, and I took the owner and all the guests with it." Lisa's knees buckled, and Eric steadied her. "No, we were just there. The guy, he gave us a room." The clerk shook his head. "You couldn't have been. There's nothing left of that place but ash." Tom pulled out the room key, the metal cold in his hand. He placed it on the counter, and the clerk recoiled. The key was blackened and charred, as if it had been pulled from a fire. The snowstorm had come out of nowhere, thick flakes cascading down in blinding waves as the group drove deeper into the remote mountain pass. Amber gripped the passenger door handle, her knuckles white. "Eli, slow down. The road's disappearing under the snow." "I'm going slow," Eli snapped, though the needle on the speedometer hovered near 40. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle, the headlights barely cutting through the flurry ahead. In the back seat, Jess and Marco huddled under a blanket, their voices low. They hadn't spoken much since the radio cut out an hour earlier. The eerie silence of the storm was punctuated only by the crunch of tires on snow and the occasional groan of the car struggling against the cold. They were miles from the last town, a forgotten dot on the map where they'd stopped for gas and coffee. The clerk had warned them about taking the mountain pass in weather like this, but Eli was insistent. "It's a shortcut," he'd said. Now it felt like a trap. "There's a turnoff up ahead," Amber said, squinting at the GPS. The signal flickered, the map struggling to load. "It might lead to a rest stop." Eli nodded, steering carefully as the car's tires skidded slightly on the icy road. The turnoff appeared, a narrow, tree-lined path barely wide enough for the car. A faded sign loomed out of the snow, the letters weathered and hard to read. Mapleton Lodge, Jess read aloud. Sounds cozy. Or like the start of a horror movie, Marco muttered, earning a glare from Amber. The lodge appeared suddenly, its dark silhouette rising out of the storm. It was larger than they'd expected, its architecture reminiscent of an old Victorian mansion. Warm light glowed from a few windows, a stark contrast to the freezing darkness outside. They parked near the front, the tires crunching on a layer of frost. The group hesitated, staring at the building. It looks welcoming, Amber said, though her voice wavered. Eli shrugged. It's either this or we freeze in the car. The front door creaked as they pushed it open. The interior was warm, the heat a welcome relief against their frozen skin. The lobby was decorated with old-fashioned furniture, a fireplace crackling in the corner. A man stood behind the reception desk, his face lined with age but kind. Welcome, he said, his voice smooth and polite. Caught in the storm, I see? Yeah, Eli replied, his breath still visible in the warmth. Do you have any rooms? Of course. The man handed over a brass key, the number 4 etched into it. It's quiet tonight. You'll have the place to yourselves. That should have been their first warning. The room was cozy, but outdated. A 4-poster bed took up most of the space, its canopy casting shadows on the walls. A single window overlooked the snowy expanse outside, frost creeping along the edges of the glass. Not bad, Marco said, throwing himself onto the bed. Could be worse. Amber sat near the window, her unease growing. I don't like this place. It feels wrong. Eli ignored her, flipping through a binder of lodge rules. Jess, always the skeptic, rolled her eyes. It's just old. Not every creaky building is haunted. But as the night wore on, the sense of unease deepened. It started with small things, a faint tapping at the window, though they were on the second floor. Whispers, barely audible, seemed to drift through the walls. Marco joked to lighten the mood. Maybe it's the ghost of a disgruntled housekeeper. Amber didn't laugh. Stop. I'm serious. Then came the footsteps. Slow, deliberate pacing in the hallway. Eli peeked out the door, but the corridor was empty, the carpet undisturbed. Probably the old guy from the front desk, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. At midnight, the lights flickered. The fireplace in the lobby, visible from their room, extinguished in an instant. The temperature plummeted, their breaths visible again. I'm not staying here, Amber declared, grabbing her coat. I don't care about the storm. We're leaving. Jess moved to protest, but stopped when she saw Amber's face. She was pale, her eyes wide. What's wrong? Amber pointed to the window. The frost on the glass had shifted, forming letters. Get out! The group rushed downstairs, finding the front desk abandoned. The door was locked, though none of them remembered locking it. As Eli struggled with the handle, a low groan echoed through the lobby. From the shadows, a figure emerged. It was the man from earlier, but his face was different now. His skin stretched too tight, his eyes sunken and black. His voice was distorted, layered with an unnatural echo. You should have stayed in your car. Panic set in. Jess grabbed a chair, throwing it at the window, but the glass didn't shatter. Instead, the frost crept inward, spreading across the walls and floor. The temperature dropped further, their breaths now coming in frantic gasps. The man, or whatever he was, stepped closer, his movements unnatural, as if he were a puppet on strings. You're not the first to come here. You won't be the last. Eli finally forced the door open, and they stumbled out into the storm. The cold bit at their skin, but they didn't stop running until the lodge was out of sight. When they reached the car, it was covered in a thick layer of snow, the tires frozen in place. Jess turned back, pointing. Look! The lodge was gone. In its place was an empty clearing, the snow undisturbed, as if nothing had ever been there. They spent the rest of the night huddled in the car, too afraid to sleep. When morning came, a plow truck found them and towed them back to town. The driver listened as they told their story, his face grim. Mapleton Lodge burned down 20 years ago, he said. Killed everyone inside. Folks say the storm comes every year, luring people in. You're lucky to be alive. They didn't feel lucky. For the rest of their lives, none of them could bear the sight of snow. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, an inky ribbon cutting through a landscape of barren trees and frost-covered fields. Ava had been driving for hours, the hum of the car's engine the only sound in the suffocating silence. It was supposed to be a quick road trip to visit her sister, but a series of wrong turns had left her lost in the middle of nowhere. The GPS had long since lost its signal, leaving her with only the eerie glow of her headlights and the weight of her own unease. The storm hit without warning. Heavy flakes of snow began to fall, thick and fast, blurring the road until it seemed as if she were driving through a tunnel of white. The tires slid slightly on the ice, and Ava's grip on the steering wheel tightened. She needed to find shelter, but there hadn't been a single sign of civilization for miles. Then she saw it. A flickering neon light in the distance. Roadside Motel. The sign read, the letters buzzing faintly against the storm. Relief washed over her as she pulled into the lot, the tires crunching over freshly fallen snow. The building was small and rundown, its paint peeling and windows clouded with frost, but it was a haven compared to the unforgiving cold outside. Ava stepped into the lobby, the bell above the door jingling weakly. The warmth hit her like a wall, though the air felt strangely heavy, carrying a faint metallic scent. Behind the counter stood an older man, his face pale and drawn, his eyes sunken yet alert. "Welcome," he said, his voice gravely. "Rough night to be on the road." "Yeah," Ava replied, shivering despite the warmth. "Do you have a room?" He slid a key across the counter, the number 7 etched into its surface. "Second floor, end of the hall." Ava took the key, thanked him, and headed upstairs. The hallway was dimly lit, the carpet threadbare, and the walls lined with faded photographs of landscapes that seemed oddly out of place. Her room was small and Spartan, the bed covered in a faded quilt, the single window offering a view of the snowstorm raging outside. She locked the door and set her bag on the bed, her exhaustion finally catching up with her. As she pulled off her boots, a strange sound broke through the silence, a faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate. It was coming from the window. Ava froze, the second floor. Who or what could be tapping on her window at that height? Slowly, she approached the glass, her breath fogging up the pane as she peered outside. The snow swirled in chaotic patterns, but there was nothing there. She exhaled in relief, chalking it up to nerves and the wind. Still, she pulled the curtains shut, not wanting to see the storm anymore. The tapping started again. This time it was louder, more insistent. Ava's heart raced as she backed away from the window, her eyes darting toward the door. Maybe she should go back to the lobby, tell the man downstairs something wasn't right. But when she reached for the doorknob, she noticed something strange. The photographs on the walls. They weren't landscapes anymore. The frames now held grainy black and white images of people. But their faces were wrong. Blurred, smudged, their features distorted as if they'd been caught mid-scream. A chill ran down her spine as she realized the figures seemed to be looking directly at her. The tapping turned into banging. Ava spun around, her breath catching in her throat. The curtains were billowing slightly, as if someone or something was standing just outside the window. Summoning every ounce of courage, she yanked them open. The window was empty, but written in the frost, clear as day, were the words, "Get out now!" Ava didn't wait. She grabbed her bag and bolted out the door, her pulse pounding in her ears. The hallway seemed longer than before, the photographs on the walls now shifting as she ran, the faces following her movements. Shadows flickered at the edges of her vision, accompanied by whispers that grew louder with every step. She reached the lobby, breathless and panicked, but it was empty. The old man was gone, the desk abandoned. The front door was locked, the key missing from the bolt. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. "Is anyone here?" The whispers stopped. For a moment the world was eerily still. Then from behind her came a low, guttural voice. "You shouldn't have come here." She spun around, but there was no one there. The lobby was empty, the shadows pressing in like a living thing. Ava stumbled backward, her hands scrabbling for the lock on the door. Finally, the bolt gave way, and she burst outside into the storm. Her car was covered in snow, but she didn't care. She clawed at the windshield, clearing just enough to see, and jumped inside. The engine sputtered to life, and she tore out of the parking lot without looking back. As she sped down the deserted highway, her breath fogging up the cold interior, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The motel was gone. In its place was an empty field, untouched by snow, as if it had never been there. Ava didn't stop driving until the sun rose, the storm finally breaking. When she reached the nearest town, she tried to explain what had happened, but the locals only exchanged uneasy glances. That road's been closed for years, one of them said. There hasn't been a motel out there since the fire. What fire? Ava asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man hesitated before answering. The roadside motel burned down 20 years ago, killed everyone inside. They say the storm comes back every year, looking for more guests. The snow came thick and fast, blanketing the long stretch of road with an oppressive silence. Lily adjusted the heater dial, her breath still visible in the freezing air. The old sedan protested with groans and rattles as it navigated the icy terrain, its headlights cutting feebly through the swirling storm. She shouldn't have taken the back roads. Her friends had warned her, but she hated the idea of highway traffic. Now she was alone, hours behind schedule, with no cell service and a gas tank hovering near empty. As she rounded a sharp curve, her headlights illuminated something that made her heart stop. A figure standing in the middle of the road. She slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car slid to a stop. The figure didn't move, standing unnaturally still. It was a man, dressed in a tattered coat and boots, his head bowed low enough that she couldn't see his face. Lily cracked her window slightly, the freezing air biting at her skin. "Are you okay?" she called out. The man didn't respond, but he raised one hand, pointing toward the woods. Her stomach tightened. "Look, I can call for help if—" Before she could finish, the man turned abruptly and walked into the trees, disappearing into the storm. Lily sat frozen for a moment, her pulse hammering in her ears. Something about the encounter felt wrong. Then she noticed it. Her headlights were illuminating deep footprints in the snow, leading out of the woods to where the man had stood. But there were no prints leading back. A shiver ran down her spine. She locked the doors and pressed on, keeping an eye on the rearview mirror. The road twisted and turned, each corner feeling more isolated than the last. After what felt like hours, the trees opened up to reveal an old gas station. The sign was broken, its letters faded and unreadable, but the lights inside were on. Relief washed over her as she pulled in, the tires crunching over the snow. The bell above the door jingled as she stepped inside, the warm air carrying the faint scent of grease and old coffee. A man stood behind the counter, his face gaunt and pale, his eyes dark and sunken. He didn't smile when she entered. "Fill up?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. Yeah," she replied, glancing nervously around. The shelves were mostly empty, stocked with dusty cans and faded snacks. A single bulb flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the floor. As he handed her a receipt, she noticed something odd. His hand was mottled with frostbite, the skin a sickly gray. "You shouldn't be out here," he said suddenly, his voice sharper now. "The storm's not natural." "What do you mean?" Lily asked, her grip tightening on the counter. The man didn't answer. Instead, he gestured toward a rack of maps by the window. "Take one of those. Stay on the main road." Lily grabbed a map and nodded, eager to leave. She paid quickly and stepped outside to pump the gas. The storm was worsening, the wind howling through the trees like a living thing. As she filled the tank, she thought she saw movement out of the corner of her eye, a shadow darting between the pumps. Her heart raced, but when she turned to look, there was nothing there. She got back in the car and sped off, the gas station disappearing quickly in the rearview mirror. The map lay unfolded on the passenger seat, its paper yellowed with age. She traced her route with one finger, realizing she wasn't far from the highway. Relief surged through her. She was almost out of this nightmare. But the relief was short-lived. The headlights illuminated something ahead. A car, abandoned in the middle of the road. Its hood was up, steam billowing out into the cold night air. Lily slowed down, her grip tightening on the wheel. As she approached, she noticed the driver's door was open. No one was inside. She stopped the car, debating whether to get out. The thought of being stranded in this storm with no one around sent a chill through her. But just as she reached for the door handle, she saw it. Movement in the rearview mirror. A man stood behind her car, his face obscured by the swirling snow. It was the same man from earlier, his tattered coat flapping in the wind. He raised one hand again, pointing toward the woods. "No," Lily whispered, her voice trembling. "Not again." She floored the gas pedal, the tires spinning before catching on the icy road. The figure vanished into the storm as she sped away, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. The road seemed endless now, the storm closing in tighter with every mile. She glanced at the map again, her fingers trembling as she traced her route. But something was wrong. The road she was on wasn't on the map. Panic set in as the realization hit her. She was driving in circles. The same twisted trees, the same sharp bends in the road. And then she saw it again. The same abandoned car, steam still rising from the hood. "No, no, no," she screamed, slamming the brakes. The figure appeared once more, standing just ahead of the car, but this time he was closer. His face was still obscured, but she could see his hand, gray and frostbitten, just like the man at the gas station. He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. The car's engine sputtered, the lights dimming as the cold seemed to seep into the vehicle itself. Lily screamed as the figure reached out, his hand pressing against the driver's side window. The frost spread from his touch, crawling across the glass like living veins. The last thing she saw before the world went black was his face, hollow, featureless, and void of anything human. When rescuers found her car the next morning, it was buried in snow. The engine was dead, the interior coated in frost. Of Lily, there was no sign, just a single set of footprints leading from the car into the woods, where they disappeared entirely. The wind howled like a living thing, shaking the car as Daniel tightened his grip on the wheel. He and his girlfriend Maya had planned their winter road trip for months, hoping for a scenic drive through snow-blanketed landscapes. What they hadn't accounted for was a freak storm rolling in, obscuring the road and turning the journey into a nightmare. "We should have stopped at that diner back there," Maya muttered, peering out at the swirling snow. "This is dangerous." Daniel didn't respond. His jaw was tight, his knuckles white as he navigated the slippery road. The GPS had lost signal an hour ago, and the two-lane highway was devoid of other cars. It felt like they were the only ones left in the world. The storm intensified, and Maya gasped as the headlights illuminated something ahead, a wooden sign half buried in snow. "Turn off here," she said, pointing. "It looks like there's a motel or something." Daniel hesitated, but eventually turned down the narrow side road. The trees closed in, their skeletal branches reaching toward the car like claws. After what felt like an eternity, a cluster of buildings came into view, their outlines blurred by the storm. A faded sign swung in the wind, Pine Hollow Lodge. The parking lot was empty, and the building itself looked abandoned, its windows dark and lifeless. But a dim light flickered inside the lobby, a beacon of hope in the oppressive storm. "Better than freezing out here," Daniel said, pulling into a spot near the entrance. Inside, the air was musty, carrying the scent of mildew and decay. The lobby was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. Behind the counter sat an older woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes shadowed as if she hadn't slept in years. "Welcome to Pine Hollow," she said in a monotone voice. "Checking in?" Daniel exchanged a glance with Maya. Yeah, just for the night." The woman handed them a key without asking for payment. The brass tag read Room 2003. Top floor, end of the hall. They climbed the creaky staircase, the wood groaning beneath their feet. The hallway was dimly lit, the bulbs flickering sporadically. The carpet was threadbare, the faded floral pattern barely visible. When they reached their room, Maya hesitated. "This place feels off," she whispered. Daniel pushed the door open, revealing a simple room with a bed, a dresser, and a window overlooking the parking lot. It was cold, the radiator hissing weakly in the corner, but it would do for the night. As they settled in, Maya noticed something strange. The mirror above the dresser was slightly tilted, its surface warped. She leaned closer, her breath fogging the glass. For a moment, she thought she saw movement, something shifting in the reflection that wasn't in the room. "Daniel, come here," she said, her voice shaking. But when he joined her, the mirror showed nothing unusual. "It's just an old, weird mirror," he said, brushing it off. "Let's get some sleep." They climbed into the cold bed, huddling together for warmth as the wind howled outside. But sleep didn't come easily. The walls of the lodge seemed to amplify every creak and groan, the sounds echoing like whispers in the dark. At some point in the night, Maya woke with a start. The room was pitch black, the faint glow from the parking lot gone. She reached for Daniel, but her hand met only the cold, empty sheets. "Daniel?" she called, her voice trembling. A soft tapping sound came from the corner of the room. Her eyes adjusted to the dark, and she saw him, standing by the mirror, his back to her. "Daniel, what are you doing?" He didn't respond. He was motionless, his head tilted slightly as if listening to something. Then, without warning, he raised his hand and pressed it against the mirror. "Maya," he said, his voice low and distorted like it was coming from somewhere else. "Come here." Every instinct told her not to move, but her feet carried her forward. As she got closer, she saw the mirror more clearly. The reflection didn't match the room. In the glass, the walls were cracked and stained, the bed rotted and broken, and Daniel's reflection wasn't him at all. The figure in the mirror grinned, its face stretched unnaturally wide. Its eyes were dark voids, empty of anything human. It raised its hand, mirroring Daniel's movement, but on its palm was a symbol, a jagged, spiraling mark that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. Maya stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of the bed. "Daniel, stop!" she screamed. But when she looked again, he was gone. The mirror was empty, its warped surface smooth and blank. She didn't remember running out of the room. The next thing she knew, she was in the lobby, gasping for breath. The old woman was still behind the counter, but her appearance had changed. Her face was sunken, her eyes milky white. "Leaving so soon?" the woman asked, her voice dripping with mockery. Maya turned and bolted out into the storm, her screams swallowed by the howling wind. When she reached the parking lot, the car was still there, but the lodge behind her was gone. In its place stood a crumbling foundation, overgrown with weeds and blanketed in snow. The police found her hours later, wandering along the highway, incoherent and shaking. They said there hadn't been a Pine Hollow Lodge in decades. It had burned down in a fire, killing everyone inside. And when they searched her car, they found the room key sitting on the passenger seat. The brass tag read Skahardred 203, but the number had been scratched out, replaced by that same spiraling mark.